This is our second discussion in political philosophy, and we're going to be talking about war. In our last discussion, one of the themes I covered was that political relations have been defined by domination across human history. It's not the only political relation, but it is one of the major relations, and there is no political relation of domination that is more acute, more salient, or more destructive than war. So we're going to talk about that. And I want to be clear that this is probably the most personal topic for me in these discussions. I am a war veteran. I served 5 years in the United States Army, which included 2 tours of Iraq from 2004 until 2008. I served a part of every one of those years in Operation Iraqi Freedom. So I've seen war firsthand. I've had the opportunity and the privilege to think a lot about war over the years to try to process my own experience and that of fellow veterans, but also people engaged in wars all over our global community. We're going to start here with a reading from President Dwight Eisenhower. There's going to be quite a bit from Eisenhower in this lecture. I'm going to be pulling mainly from three voices: Eisenhower, Plato, and a rather unknown voice, Smedley Butler. And the reason I'm pulling from these voices is because I think they represent a rather unique and often unheard from tradition in political thought about war. So we're going to start with a reading from Dwight Eisenhower's great speech, A Chance for Peace. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities. It is 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 in population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. It is some 50 miles of concrete highway. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. This, I repeat, is the best way of life to be found on the road the world has been taking. But this is not a way of life at all in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. It calls upon them to answer the question that stirs the hearts of all sane men: is there no other way the world may live? We seek throughout the world a peace that is true and total, which would present the world with the greatest task and the greatest opportunity of all. It is this: the dedication of the energies, the resources, and the imaginations of all peaceful nations to a new kind of war. This would be a declared total war, not upon any human enemy, but upon the brute forces of poverty and need. The peace we seek, rounded upon decent trust and cooperative effort among nations, can be fortified not by weapons of war, but by wheat and by cotton, by milk and by wool, by meat and by timber and by rice. These are words that translate into every language on earth. The monuments to this new kind of war would be these: roads and schools, hospitals and homes, food and health. We are ready, in short, to dedicate our strength to serving the needs rather than the fears of the world. I know of no course other than that marked by these and similar actions that can be called the highway of peace. Now, there are a number of reasons I'm drawing on the work of President Eisenhower. One is that as the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe during World War II, he has a very personal and profound understanding of the realities of war. He was also president during the drawdown of the Korean War, and his presidency was marked, of course, with heightened tensions with the Soviet Union. So this was not an abstract theoretical question for him. And in fact, this particular speech is significant because it was a speech that he delivered in the wake of the um, death of Joseph Stalin, which was a seismic and significant political event on the world stage. And I think what's significant about this speech is its deeply philosophical character. Eisenhower shows in the economic values of his day how every piece in a military arsenal comes at some cost to the daily needs of people. When we put our resources towards war, we're not putting them towards other things. And he asks us to consider whether there's another way to live in the world. He suggests that there is the highway of peace, which involves two ambitious goals: the abolition of war and the abolition of poverty. Only then we will be able to live in a world without war. Of course, this presupposes that we want to live in a world without war, but that has not always been obvious to people, including philosophers. When philosophers talk about war at all, it's usually to delineate between just and unjust wars, that there are some wars where participation in the war is justified and others where it is not. The problem with this just war tradition is that it allows us to continue to permit the existence of war in the world. Because if not all wars are bad or not all participants in a war are unjustified, then there's not really a clear reason to try to eliminate war from the world. By contrast, Eisenhower is calling for a vision in which all war is bad and should be abolished. For Eisenhower, war is like slavery. It simply should not be. So I've called this particular discussion War or Peace, and the subtitle is The Purpose of Politics. And that's because when we look at these questions through the lens of Plato, one of the things that Plato does in his longest political work, The Laws, is he sets out war as the fundamental political problem. That what a war does is it tears a society apart. It either rends the society itself if it's a civil war, or it results in one society being subjugated to another if it's an international war. And so war is sort of part of what politics exists to solve. It's why we do politics, is to either be victorious in war or to avoid war. But what Plato does is he draws a sharp divide between those two ways of conceptualizing war. So let's look a little bit more at how he discusses this. The contrast here you might think of would be something like a libertarian fantasy. A libertarian might say, why do we even need a society, really? I mean, couldn't we all just live by ourselves in our own little yurts? Like you get your plot of land, I get my plot of land, and we all just leave each other alone. You do what you need to do on your land, I'll do what I need to do on my land, and we'll just not mess with each other. But that's actually not really a reasonable possibility. In Plato's time, he lived on the Greek peninsula in a city-state called Athens. And a city-state was basically a nation, but it was the size of what we would consider a city today. These were very small nations. And they would often get into fights with each other. And beyond this, there was an empire neighboring them, the Persian Empire, and the Persians were always sort of eyeing the Greek peninsula and thinking about swooping in there and taking it over. So if you're living in your yurt by yourself and Sparta shows up with their armies, you're in big trouble. Or even worse, if Persia shows up with their massive armies, you're in big trouble. The only way to survive in this time is to band together with some other people and have an army of your own. So living by yourself wasn't an option, okay? You needed society for mutual protection. Okay. As such, a belief arose across many of the politicians and military leaders of Plato's day that peacetime is kind of a misnomer. It's really just a lull between wars. Peacetime is just the respite where you get a chance to rearm, make some new swords, train some new troops, restock your warehouses in case of a siege or a long combat, and then you're ready for the next fight when it comes, because it will come. And so in this mindset, they're sort of in a perpetual war, like you're either fighting a war or you're getting ready for a war. Okay. Plato wants to present a competing vision, an opposing vision to this idea that really the purpose of society, the purpose of politics is either to ensure victory in the war that you're in or to ensure victory on the next war that's coming over the horizon. So how is Plato going to respond to this? Well, what he does in the opening book of the Laws is he has his characters contemplate an analogy. He asks them to imagine a family where parents have quite a few kids, and some of the kids are kind-hearted and some of them are cruel bullies. And so the bullies always pick on and take advantage of their kind-hearted siblings. They're just not very nice. And then he says, how would you rank the following responses by the parents trying to address the situation? And yes, for those Plato scholars out there, I have slightly updated the analogy from the exact way it's given in the text, but this is the essential spirit of it. So the first option is the parents send their bad kids to a reform school. So you're not getting along with your siblings, you're driving us all crazy, you're out of here. The second response is the parents put their good kids in charge of their unkind siblings and tell the bullies to learn from their good siblings, and that the parents will enforce any discipline the good kids demand for the bullies. So essentially now they're going to reverse the hierarchy of power in the relationship so that the kind-hearted kids now have power over their bullying siblings so that they can't bully them anymore. The third option is that the parents help their kids reconcile with each other and learn to love and care for one another as they do for themselves. Okay, so that's A, B, and C. What do you think? Which of these do you think is best, second best, and third best? Well, as you might expect, Plato thinks that C is the best possible outcome, B is the next best outcome, and A is the worst outcome. Let's explore why we might rank these outcomes this way. Consider option A. In this case, the family is torn apart, right? You basically say some of the kids are no longer part of the family and they have to go live elsewhere. The only way to stop the bullying is to get rid of the bullies. It does solve the problem, certainly, but in a very divisive and exile-style manner. By contrast, B solves the problem by reversing the power dynamic. It makes it so that The kids who are doing the bullying lose their power to bully, and those who have been victims of the bullying now gain meaningful power in the relationships. And that is a real significant improvement. The aim here is that if we give power to the more kind-hearted siblings, that their good influence and their way of using that power will be an example or an inspiration to lead to hopeful transformation in their less kind-hearted siblings. And even if it doesn't, at least they're not being bullied anymore. Okay? Of course, it's not too hard to see that this could lead to resentment actually on the part of the bullies. It's hard for people who have power to lose power. And it could possibly even lead to the kind-hearted kids themselves becoming bullies as they use their newfound power to get even. The phrase power tends to corrupt. And regardless, even if none of those things happen, there's still no equality in this relationship. Power is not distributed equally. It doesn't seem like B then is as desirable as option C, where the hard work of fostering understanding, empathy, curiosity, repentance, and forgiveness happens between the bullies and their siblings, with the aim of generating love and respect between all the kids. This response produces an equality between the siblings where they can all live together in harmony. Now, there's no question that option C is going to require a lot more work and intentionality and patience than A or B. The suggestion here is not that these are equally feasible undertakings. The question is just one of which is the more preferable outcome. And it seems like C creates a community of real equality, equal distribution of power, and a true harmonious family. It's the only option where all the members of the family are familial in their love relationships and not just relying on unequal distributions of power or exile to maintain the peace. So you can sort of imagine where Plato's going to go with this. He asks his characters to connect this analogy to a political context. If society is the family, then the citizens are the kids and the parents are the government. So if there is a social conflict within the society, the government can respond in at least 3 different ways. So the first option is they can jail the oppressors, or I suppose back in Plato's day, banish the oppressors. Exile was actually a very real political possibility. I've updated it for how we tend to do things today, which is we put people who break the law in jail or prison. So that's kind of the analogy for that first option A. The analogy for response B is empower the oppressed to have power over their oppressors. So you figure out who are the victims in the society, and we're going to undertake policies that reverse the power relation so that those who have been oppressed are now given significant and meaningful political power, and those who have been the bullies of society, they have their power taken away. The third response is the government can work to promote truth and reconciliation between the oppressed and their oppressors. Like the story of the family, Plato suggests that C is the best outcome because it is only in a reconciled society that divisions heal and therefore future conflict is prevented. See, Plato is thinking not just how we solve the problem in front of us, this immediate conflict. He's thinking, how do we solve these divisions in perpetuity? In society A, the jailed oppressors can gain sympathy and support, and someday on their release, try to seize the government for their side. This is a political phenomenon that is replete throughout history. Um, those who have sort of been exiled or pushed away come back to reclaim power, sometimes decades later. In society B, resentment breeds as the oppressors wait for an opportunity to regain their power and advantage. Oftentimes, the forms of oppression take a more black market form. So they go from having a public and legal expression to having a secretive and illegal expression. Only if there is true reconciliation, such that oppressors and oppressed are both transformed into citizens of mutual respect and responsibility, can there be a future without conflict. So the issue here, if you think of B as one example, you could think of the American Civil War. So the Union troops invade the South, occupy the South. They disarm both the Confederate Army, but they also remove the Democratic Party locally from power and install Republican leaders throughout the southern states. And the idea here is, look, we've disarmed the slave powers, we've outlawed slavery, everything's good. But what ended up happening is the former Confederate powers bided their time for decades until Republican tolerance for federal occupation of southern states waned. Once the Union troops were pulled out of southern states, they returned that oppressor-oppressed relation in the form of political exclusions for Black folk, in the forms of indentured work relationships, and eventually what came to be known as the Jim Crow laws, separate but equal. And so that's the kind of problem that Plato is worried about, that if you simply give power to the oppressed and disempower the oppressor, you're still leaving seeds for a future restoration of oppressive relationships. So option C envisions something like what Martin Luther King Jr. would often advocate for, this idea that we're going to actually transform the people, oppressed and oppressor alike, into different kinds of people, people who view themselves as mutual citizens and therefore as people they have mutual responsibility for. Plato contends that to be a leader in a society means your goal is to create laws and policies that promote the common good. That is, which promote the flourishing of the whole community, not just one part of it. That means a good leader cannot promote the flourishing of oppressors at the expense of the oppressed, nor can they lift up the oppressed at the expense of oppressors. Good leaders will seek to both liberate the oppressed and reintegrate oppressors back into society. Now, in thinking about war, especially international war, we want to generalize this a little bit further. This is something that's a little more implied in Plato's discussion, but it is there. So I'm kind of drawing out some of the between the lines thinking that happens in his dialogue. But it seems like he does want this to generalize to relations between nations. So we can imagine an international model where there's three possible responses for nations that are at war with each other. So let's say that our nation is at war with another nation. We can imagine three different responses. Response A, our nation conquers the other nation and performs an existential or cultural genocide, ensuring they never threaten us again. Now, before you think that is a shocking thing to even mention, I want to be very clear. Genocide is a practice that has been performed between nations for thousands of years and has been a regular model attempted to try to prevent future war. Existential genocide is exactly what it sounds like. It's when you kill all of the other people. I'm not just talking about wiping out their armies. It's when you go into their towns and villages and you kill their civilians and their children. That way their children can't grow up, form an army, and come back and attack you in 2 decades. Okay, this is a model that was practiced widely around the world, regardless of ethnic communities and so forth. But there was also a practice of cultural genocide. In fact, the Persian Empire that was neighboring Plato's Greek city-states, they would do this very regularly. They would invade a country, take it over, enslave the people there, exile them to somewhere else, and then destroy all of their cultural artifacts and history. So that way they lose their culture, they lose their language, they lose their history, and therefore they lose their sense of it being a distinct cultural identity. And when you don't have that cultural identity, there's a sense in which you cease to exist, or you can't bond together again with the common people, and therefore you can't rise up and rebel or overthrow the nation that conquered you. So that's really the political analog for option A. And I think most of us today tend to look at this as, yeah, that creates peace, but in the worst possible way. That's not the right answer. So analog B to the examples we've been working with would be one where our nation conquers the other nation and they become an occupied territory in which they have second-class citizen status to our citizens and our government. So think here of the German occupation of France during World War II. They set up a puppet government, the Vichy government in France, but there's a very real sense in which the German will and the German occupying leaders, they held the real power. They held all the rights and privileges. So you keep France from rising up against you by making it so that they are no longer able to wield significant political power. You're not wiping them out. You're not annihilating their culture necessarily. You're just making sure that they always stay under your thumb. There's a third option. Our nation brings the war to an end in a way that allows for us to reconcile with the other nation in the aftermath to obviate any future wars between us. Once again, Plato wants to propose that C is the best possible outcome to wars between nations. Now, I'm not going to say more about that now because I'm going to come back to option C here at the end of this discussion. So we're not going to dwell on that at the moment. I just want you to sort of hold that in the back of your mind. What would it mean to bring a war to an end in a way that would lead to the possibility of reconciliation between the nations, where that reconciliation is the basis of a perpetual peace? Plato then concludes this section of the laws. He says the greatest good, however, is neither war nor civil war. God forbid we should ever need to resort to either. Instead, the greatest good is peace and goodwill among the whole community. No true statesman adopts foreign warfare as his first and only concern. One becomes a genuine lawgiver only by designing legislation about war as a tool for peace, rather than using legislation for peace as an instrument of war. So he makes this really sharp dichotomy through this discussion of saying there's one model, the model that was prevailing in his day, that said the purpose of politics is either to have victory in war or to prepare for the next war during peacetime. And Plato reverses this around. He says, no, the best possible good, the best possible end of a politics is one where you abolish the need for war, whether it's civil war or international war. The aim of a politics is to promote peace and goodwill amongst the community, which means then he views war as an opportunity to create lasting peace. That you're using war to set the groundwork to create peace. You're not using peace as an opportunity to rearm in preparation for war. So he wants to say these are mutually exclusive political aims, and there cannot be a compromise between them. So that's what we're going to think about for the rest of our topic today is in what sense is either war or peace the fundamental aim of society? To think more about this, I want to spend a little bit of time thinking about the causes of war. We're not going to go through all the wonderful sociological literature that's out there on war. The literature is quite vast and really interesting. I want to just kind of look at some things that Plato said in theorizing the causes of war um, in his in his political works. We're going to look at a passage a little later on from the Laws, but we're going to start with a few key sections from the Republic where he talks about the causes of war. So early on in book one, Plato has Socrates, who's the kind of voice of Plato in the dialogue. Plato has Socrates claim that injustice in a society causes civil war, hatred, and fighting within a community, whereas justice brings friendship and a sense of common purpose. So he's sort of envisioning that if you have a society that is riven by divisions, where there are communities within the wider community that hate each other, he's going to say this is a product of injustice in the society. If you have a just society, that justice will promote a sense of friendship between citizens and allow them to work for a common purpose. And he argues for this in a really interesting way. He says, consider three different types of political organizations: a city, a military, and a gang of thieves. Now, you may not think of a gang of thieves as a political organization, and they're not in a sort of official sense, but they are a community that's organized with certain political relationships. This is politics understood very widely, the structure of just any community that's trying to work according to a sense of norms. And he says in all three cases, a city, a military, and a gang of thieves, they're not going to be able to work towards a common purpose, even a common unjust purpose, unless they can relate to each other with justice. Let's examine what that means. So imagine you've got a city that wants to go conquer another city. So that's an unjust purpose. But the only way they're going to be able to do that is if they as a city can work together. If everybody in the city hates each other and they don't get along, they're not going to be able to form an army to go conquer the other city. So there has to be a sense of justice inside the city before they can work together to go do something else, even something that's not good. Obviously, the same would go for a military. If the military, if they don't trust each other, if they're not there to fight together and protect each other, they're not going to be a very effective military, even if what they're doing is conquering somebody else. And likewise, the gang of thieves. If the goal of the gang of thieves is to pull off this big bank heist, well, the only way they're going to do it is if they can all trust each other to perform their roles and not steal the money from each other. Otherwise, they won't be successful. So they have to have a sense of justice amongst themselves in order to successfully rob the bank. So there's this kind of basic idea that one of the core causes of divisions in society and that can lead to something like civil war is the presence of injustice itself. A little later on in the Republic in Book 2, Plato has Socrates hypothesize that an ideal society would be one where everyone has enough food and clothing, enough shelter, enough communal recreation and leisure time. So this is a place where people's needs are met. And then he has this really amazing line where he says, they'll also have plenty of sex because sex is an essential and important part of human life, not just for reproduction, but for like our enjoyment and our love for each other. But he says, sex needs to be regulated in the sense that we cannot bear more children than the society's resources allow, lest that society falls into either poverty or war. Now, that's a really interesting remark. What he means here is that one of the causes of war is a competition over social goods, all the things that we just listed off: food, clothing, shelter, leisure time, um, and social recognition. If there is more of us than there are of these things, then we're going to compete with each other to get what we need, even at the expense of our fellow neighbors. So if we have more babies than the resources of society can bear, that's going to lead to conflict. So Plato is saying it's not enough to produce sufficient material goods and cultural rituals to provide for everyone. We also have to regulate how many babies we have to prevent overtaxing our social material production and the resources of our environment. How much food can be grown on the land, how much water is available, these kinds of things. Now, a little later on, Plato has Socrates contrast the ideal society. This is one where we have enough for everybody, but not too much. He calls this the healthy society. He contrasts this with the luxurious society, which has a higher risk of falling into warfare, both civil warfare and international warfare. In a luxurious society, this is going to be one that has more than just meeting our needs. This is where we've got things like advertising, social media, Las Vegas, the National Football League, strip clubs, all this stuff that nobody needs, but that we enjoy for entertainment and pleasure seeking. And he says, in a society like this, you're going to need a much larger labor force to provide all of these things. And so now the size of the community is expanding to meet the demands for all of this pleasure seeking, rather than what we were having in the healthy society, where the size of the population only expanded to the degree that the basic needs of the society are met, but not expanding beyond what the society can handle given their resources. So let me say that again. That was a little bit of a word salad. In the healthy society, we're trying to maintain the population of the community to not grow beyond what the resources of that society can handle. Whereas in the luxurious society, we're growing the society to meet the ever-growing cravings that people have for more and more pleasure seeking. Okay? So that means that there's going to be a demand for much more resources. The society is going to be much larger, and it's going to be much more focused on meeting desires for pleasure rather than basic needs. And so Plato then makes this really insightful comment. He says, the land, I suppose, that used to be adequate to feed the population we had then will cease to be adequate and become too small. Then we'll have to seize some of our neighbors' land if we're going to have enough pasture and plowland. And won't our neighbors want to seize part of ours as well, if they too have surrendered themselves to the endless acquisition of money and have overstepped the limits of their necessities? Then our next step will be war, won't it? We won't say yet whether the effects of war are good or bad, but only that we've now found the origins of war. It comes from those same desires that are most of all responsible for the bad things that happen to cities and the individuals in them. That is, the desires of injustice mentioned above. So there's this idea that once you start pleasure seeking, you're always craving more and more. And once your society starts to expand in population beyond what the resources can provide for, you're going to need more resources, which means you're going to need more land. So you're going to need to go take somebody else's land. And so this leads to conflict, it leads to injustice, and that produces war. Notice that he's introducing both civil and international war in this passage. If my country has good copper mines, but your country has oil and we need oil, how are we going to get it? We can trade with your country, copper for oil, but suppose that we need a lot more oil than you need copper, then you can charge us a lot for the oil because you know that we really need it. Wouldn't it be nice to just own the oil fields ourselves instead? If we could just get an army together and go conquer you and just take the oil for ourselves? So you can see this is the kind of thinking that leads to warmongering. We get in one more elaboration of some of these themes from Plato, this time in the Laws. And here he's going to talk about how wealth inequalities produce war. So this is a quote. He says, "We maintain that if a state is to avoid the greatest plague of all, I mean civil war, though civil disintegration would be a better term, extreme poverty and wealth must not be allowed to arise in any section of the citizen body, because both lead to both these disasters. That is why the legislator must now announce the acceptable limits of health and poverty. The lower limit of poverty must be the value of the holding, which is to be permanent. No official nor anyone else who has the ambitions can be thought virtuous will ever overlook the diminution of any man's holdings. The legislature will use the holding as his unit of measure and allow a man to possess twice, thrice, or up to 4 times its value. If anyone acquires more than this, by finding treasure trove, or by gift, or by a good stroke of business, or some other lucky chance which presents him with more than he's allowed, he should hand over the surplus to the state." Now, let's translate that into some modern terms. He's saying that social disintegration and civil war comes from either a portion of the population falling into poverty or a portion of the population falling into wealth, great wealth, or both. So wealth inequality, okay? And the reason he thinks this is because if some people are really poor, that's going to breed resentment in them against those who are not poor. And if some have great wealth, that's going to lead them to no longer identify with the rest of their community in terms of needs and political goals because they don't have the same needs as everybody else. They can use their great wealth to buy things for themselves that meet their needs that other people simply can't. So when it comes to, say, creating a shared healthcare system, people who can afford private healthcare are not going to be as incentivized to contribute to something like that because they don't need it in the way that the rest of the population does. So Plato, 2,400 years ago, is envisioning this kind of inequality leading to civil disintegration. So he says we should ban that in society to prevent war. And how does he propose banning it? Well, he says you have to have a floor and a ceiling. You have to make it so that nobody can fall into poverty. So there has to be a sort of bottom level of what people, how poor people can become. And then the wealthiest person in society can only have 4 times the amount of the poorest in society. Okay, so there's a 4-to-1 ratio here between the wealthiest and the poorest. So that's a very, very small wealth inequality gap. And the way that he would enforce this, as he says in the last line, is he would have a tax on all the wealth people earn above 4 times the poorest in the society. Now, if that sounds extreme to you, or if you start wanting to charge Plato with communism, I would like to point out that during Eisenhower's presidency, the tax rate on the highest, on the wealthiest part of the population was 92%. 92%. Now, Plato is probably closer to 100% here in the proposal, but the difference between 100% and 92% is 8%. It's not much. So we can haggle over whether the tax rate on people who earn more than 4 times the lowest earners in the society, we can haggle over what that rate should be. But whether you think it should be Eisenhower's rate of 92% or Plato's rate of 100%, the point is, if you want to avoid war, you cannot allow a portion of the population to become vastly wealthier than the rest of the population, or so Plato wants us to think. So those are some causes of war. We're going to now look at another cause of war. And this is to recognize the profitability of war itself. And I'm going to be drawing these ideas from Major General Smedley Butler, who at the time of his death was the most decorated Marine in United States history. He fought in a lot of U.S. conflicts in both the 19th and 20th centuries, including World War I. And at the age of 53, he wrote a book called War is a Racket. And I'd like to just take us through some of the main argument of that book. So our first question is, what is a racket? If he thinks war is a racket, what's that? Well, racketeering is a legal term that describes coercive or fraudulent practices that are designed to produce lucrative profits. And typically this happens in business or in illegal crime organizations. Butler considers war to be a racket. That is a brutal and dehumanizing conflict that those in power use to make money on the side. So it's quite a claim. Let's see why he thinks that. He says, a racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of people. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. Now, why would that be? Why would anybody make money off of war? I mean, that seems obscene. Well, Butler contends wars cost money and they require vast material resources. That provides an enormous incentive to those with great wealth to either invest in war bonds, which make a sizable return with interest after the war concludes, and two, to invest in manufacturing for war-related goods and services. Butler lists off some of these in his day. He's writing this in 1935, so before World War II. He says munitions makers, bankers, shipbuilders, manufacturers, meat packers, speculators, they would fare well in war. So these are sectors of private industry that provide goods and services that a nation needs in order to wage war against another nation. And there is a third option, of course, which is to use the chaos created by war to exploit war-torn countries for their natural resources like oil or precious minerals. So sometimes businesses will use the cover of war to conduct exploitative businesses in war-torn countries. The point is, under all three categories, war is a lucrative business. It makes people involved in defense manufacturing profitable. Butler is quick to remind us, as a veteran, what the real cost of war is. Newly placed gravestones, mangled bodies, shattered minds, broken hearts and homes, economic instability, depression, and all its attendant miseries. And I would like to add to his list the extreme environmental degradation. We often don't think or talk about harm to the environment through war, but war is incredibly bad for ecosystems. Bombs and artillery fire kill millions of animals and often leave good land desolate and unfarmable. Trees are cut down and burned. Whole ecosystems get wiped out. In naval battles, sunken ships can leak oil and other chemicals that never get properly cleaned up. So if you think about when an oil company has an oil spill, say in the Gulf, where there's this big to-do and the governments make the companies go down there and pay for the oil spill cleanup. But that doesn't happen typically in war environments where ships and submarines are attacked and sunk. The consequences of their chemical leakages are just left as they are. Butler, writing in 1935, just as fascism was reaching peak power in European countries, took seriously the massive military buildup in countries like Italy and Germany. They are not being trained for dancing, he wrote. If nations have massive military forces, it's because they intend to use them. And if they want to use them, it must be because there is some profit in doing so. In other words, countries wouldn't fight if they didn't get anything out of it. Like there's some advantage, some benefit that they see to engaging in war. Butler writes, the normal profits of a business concern in the United States are 6, 8, or 10, maybe 12% at best. But wartime profits, that's another matter. They can be 20, 60, 100, 300, and even 1,800%. The sky is the limit. All that traffic will bear. Uncle Sam has the money. Let's get it. Of course, it isn't put that crudely in wartime. It's dressed into speeches about patriotism, love of country, and we must all put our shoulders to the wheel. But the profits jump and leap and skyrocket and are safely pocketed. Now, he's made an argument here. He's claimed that you get much better profit margins during war for certain companies than in peacetime. What's the evidence for this? Well, he gives an example from his day, and then I'm going to offer a second example from the contemporary situation. Butler offers the DuPont Corporation, which is actually a corporation that still exists today and has many defense contracts with the United States. They're a chemical company, and during World War I, they actually claimed that the chemicals they produced for the United States and US allies won the war. Now, whether that was true or not, I don't know, but they actually testified before Congress that their chemical products were instrumental in deciding the outcome of the war. Butler observes that before World War I, they were averaging about $6 million a year in profits, which was a lot of money for this would be pre-1915. Okay, so we're talking, or 1914, I guess. We're talking way back in the day. By contrast, he compares their profit margin from 1914 to 1918, when they had defense contracts for World War I. They were making $58 million a year. That's a 10 times increase in their profit margin. Okay, so that's the kind of evidence that he's looking at to say, look, people are making a lot of money off of war. Is this still true today? Well, I would argue it's been true of every war that the United States has been involved with, even indirectly, up to the present time. And as an example, I want to take the Ukraine war, a war that has broad support in the United States. The United States is not directly fighting the war in Ukraine, but we are an indirect arms and training supplier. And I will just have you know that the United States is the biggest arms supplier in the world. You want to know where all the guns, bombs, and various forms of artillery shells come from? They come from the United States. In the first year of the war between Ukraine and Russia, 2022 to 2023, the United States provided $44 billion in Pentagon defense spending for the war in Ukraine. Now, where did this money go? To the Ukrainians? No, not directly. It's not like Congress authorizes money and then we write the country of Ukraine a check and then they do with the money what they need. That's not how it works. What it went to was defense contracts with companies like Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics, who then produce the various weapon systems that we then ship over to the Ukrainians. Okay. Now, even if you think supporting the Ukrainian fighting forces is a good goal, we must recognize that supporting Ukraine is a multi-billion-dollar enterprise for the companies that I just named. As long as the war in Ukraine drags on, they make billions. So let me ask you this. What kind of interest do they have more? Do they have an interest in the war in Ukraine ending quickly with a decisive victory for Ukraine? Or do they have an interest in Ukraine surviving but not being able to win the war so that it drags on year after year after year? These are not equal outcomes for these companies. They will make so much more money if Ukraine can survive but not win the war. And I would point out that these outcomes are not morally equal. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russians have died in this war. The longer it drags on, the more people die. So if the best outcome is that the war ends quickly and decisively, but these companies have a strong financial interest in the war not ending for some time, how do you think that will lead them to influence the government and the Pentagon as they make decisions about how to support Ukraine in this war? I leave that for you to decide the question, but that is the kind of economic problem that Smedley Butler is recognizing that led him to say war is a racket. So what should we do about this? Butler recommends 3 reforms in the book to prevent war and to eliminate especially the racketeering dimension of war. He says war must not produce profits for governments or the private sector. All monetary gains must be taxed at 100% and used for reparations purposes. That means that we have to make it so that people and private industries cannot profit off of war. Whatever money gets made in the conduct of the war, that money is going to be taxed for the sole purpose of reparations. And if you don't know what reparations are, that's rebuilding the war-torn areas and rebuilding the lives of people who had their lives ripped apart by the war. Second proposal, we must permit those aged 18 to 25 to either vote on a referendum for the war or have the right to opt out of the war. Since war overwhelmingly kills off our youth, and they make up the majority of frontline troops and therefore the majority of deaths in war, the ability to wage war should be beholden to their willingness to fight it. You can't wage war unless the people who are going to bear the brunt of the costs are willing to wage the war. And 3, he says standing military should exist solely for defense of the homeland, never for the purpose of foreign incursion. This is like something like the Japanese Defense Force. That's was one of the major reforms that the Allied forces required of Japan in the wake of World War II, is that they could no longer have a standing army for the purposes of foreign war. They could only have an army for the purposes of national defense. I would suggest that in this third reform, he's writing in 1935. The United Nations does not exist at this time. There is a body called the League of Nations, but it's pretty different. So today, I think it is reasonable to say there could be a secondary purpose of a standing military, which is to provide that military as a loan to the United Nations for the purposes of going into war-torn countries like, say, Syria or Sudan, and establishing a military supremacy through the United Nations for the purposes of reconstruction. That is, where the United Nations has a monopoly on militarized violence in that country so that the country can bring the war to an end and begin the process of rebuilding. That actually seems to me like a noble purpose for a military. But that's the only change I think I would make to his proposals. So why don't we make these changes? Why haven't we been able to get rid of warmongering and the profitability of war in the world since Smedley Butler was writing in 1935? Well, he notes about the international peace talks of his day. And I just going to note that what he says here sounds an awful lot like peace talks that happen in our world today. He writes, very little, if anything, has been accomplished to assure us that the World War, that is World War I, really was the war to end all wars. Yes, we have had disarmament conferences and limitations of arms conferences, but they don't mean a thing. One has just failed. The results of another have been nullified. We send our professional soldiers and our sailors and our politicians and our diplomats to these conferences. And what happens? The professional soldiers and sailors don't want to disarm. No admiral wants to be without a ship. No general wants to be without a command. Both mean men without jobs. So they're not for disarmament. They cannot be for the limitations of arms. And at all these conferences, lurking in the background, but all powerful just the same, are the sinister agents of those who profit by war. They see to it that these conferences do not disarm or seriously limit armaments. And again, if you think about the companies that I just mentioned, like Raytheon or Lockheed Martin, they make money by building munitions to sell to the United States and other countries. So if we were all to lay down our arms, they would lose a lot of money, and they don't want to do that. Butler concludes by warning us that the next wars will not be decided by soldiers, but by scientists, inventing cruel means of gaining military advantage through gases and chemicals. Butler died in 1940, 5 years later, and so he did not live to see a much greater horror than even he feared emerge from the laboratories of the United States, the nuclear bomb. The vindication of his fears only makes more apt the final sentence of his book. So I say, to hell with war. Um, he died in 1940, just before the United States would enter World War II. President Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of the Allied forces in World War II in Europe, and who was the president who brought the Korean War to an armistice in 1953, ended up echoing very similar warnings to Smedley Butler as he prepared to leave the office of the presidency at the end of his term in 1961. And this is the famous military-industrial complex speech. Now, what I'm going to do here is I want to just highlight a couple themes that he mentions in the speech, so that you have a sense of how it connects with Smedley Butler's writing in 1935. So this is, 30 years, almost 25 years later. It's amazing how much resonance there are between the two. And then we're going to listen to the second half of Eisenhower's speech, because I think it's really good to hear all of his words and the full context of what he has to say. But here's a few key highlights that I want us to know or to listen for. Eisenhower warns of a growing entanglement between military needs and industrial activity. It will be the federal government that drives defense spending in the future, and the lure of money will be the greatest temptation, he says. Eisenhower also validates Smedley Butler's prediction about the centrality of the scientist. Ike warns of a public policy that becomes captive to a scientific technological elite. Eisenhower says that the only way to build a future is where conferences, the kind of thing that Butler was just talking about, are one of equals, where the weakest among us is both able to come to the table and has all the opportunities to contribute as anyone else at the table. That table, Eisenhower says, though scarred by many past frustrations, cannot be abandoned for the certain agony of the battlefield. Meaning we have to find a way to solve political differences at home and abroad without resorting to warfare. Perhaps the most important part of the speech is Eisenhower's acknowledgement that it was a value of his administration to work for the abolition of war, and that he was unable to build a future with this possibility. Ike says, "I confess that I lay down my official responsibilities as president with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy the civilization which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. Happily, I can say that war has been avoided. Steady progress toward our ultimate goal has been made, but so much remains to be done. As a private citizen, I shall never cease to do what little I can to help the world advance along that road towards peace." So these are stirring words, and in a moment I'm going to have us think about his observation in 1961 that lasting peace does not seem in sight. And here today, I don't know that we've made much more progress, so we're going to think a little bit about why that is and what we can do about it. But now I want us to listen to Eisenhower's speech. We're not going to listen to the whole speech, but we are going to listen to the entirety of the second half, where he makes some of the quotes and comments that I just noted.
Until the latest of our world conflicts, the United States had no armaments industry. American makers of plowshares could, with time and as required, make swords as well. But we can no longer risk emergency improvisation of national defense. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. Added to this, 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. We annually spend on military security alone more than the net income of all United States corporations. Now, this conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry is new in the American experience. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development, yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. Our toil, resources, and livelihood are all involved. So is the very structure of our society. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together. Akin to and largely responsible for the sweeping changes in our industrial military posture has been the technological revolution during recent decades. In this revolution, research has become central. It also becomes more formalized, complex, and costly. A steadily increasing share is conducted for, by, or at the direction of the federal government. Today, the solitary inventor, tinkering in his shop, has been overshadowed by task forces of scientists in laboratories and testing fields. In the same fashion, the free university, historically the fountainhead of free ideas and scientific discovery, has experienced a revolution in the conduct of research. Partly because of the huge costs involved, a government contract becomes virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. For every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system, ever aiming toward the supreme goals of our free society. Another factor in maintaining balance involves the element of time. As we peer into society's future, we, you and I, and our government must avoid the impulse to live only for today, plundering for our own ease and convenience the precious resources of tomorrow. We cannot mortgage the material assets of our grandchildren without risking the loss also of their political and spiritual heritage. We want democracy to survive for all generations to come, not to become the insolvent phantom of tomorrow. During the long lane of the history yet to be written, America knows that this world of ours, ever growing smaller, must avoid becoming a community of dreadful fear and hate, and be instead a proud confederation of mutual trust and respect. Such a confederation must be one of equals. The weakest must come to the conference table with the same confidence as do we, protected as we are by our moral, economic, and military strength. That table, though scarred by many past frustrations, cannot be abandoned for the certainty agony of disarmament of the battlefield. Disarmament with mutual honor and confidence is a continuing imperative. Together we must learn how to compose differences, not with arms, but with intellect and decent purpose. Because this need is so sharp and apparent, I confess that I lay down my official responsibilities in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. As one who has witnessed the horror and the lingering sadness of war, as one who knows that another war could utterly destroy this civilization, which has been so slowly and painfully built over thousands of years, I wish I could say tonight that a lasting peace is in sight. Happily, I can say that war has been avoided. Steady progress toward our ultimate goal has been made, but so much remains to be done. As a private citizen, I shall never cease to do what little I can to help the world advance along that road. So in this, my last good night to you as your president, I thank you for the many opportunities you have given me for public service in war and in peace. I trust in that service you find some things worthy. As for the rest of it, I know you will find ways to improve performance in the future. You and I, my fellow citizens, need to be strong in our faith that all nations under God will reach the goal of peace with justice. May we be ever unswerving in devotion to principle, confident but humble with power, diligent in pursuit of the nation's great goals. To all the peoples of the world, I once more give expression to America's prayerful and continuing aspiration. We pray that peoples of all faiths, all races, all nations may have their great human needs satisfied, that those now denied opportunity shall come to enjoy it to the full, that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings, those who have freedom will understand also its heavy responsibility. That all who are insensitive to the needs of others will learn charity, and that the sources, scourges of poverty, disease, and ignorance will be made disappear from the earth. And that in the goodness of time, all peoples will come to live together in a peace guaranteed by the binding force of mutual respect and love. Now, on Friday noon, I am to become a private citizen. I am proud to do so. I look forward to it. Thank you, and good night.
So now we're going to ask what to do. One of the advantages of political philosophy, Plato says, is that we get to think about these hard political questions at leisure. We're not in the legislative chamber trying to draft a bill before the deadline or get a budget passed, and we're not a general on the battlefield trying to conduct a war campaign. It's hard to ask the questions of what should we do if you're in the middle of war itself. I don't expect a Ukrainian on the battlefield to be doing political philosophy. So it is a great gift and privilege, those of us who have the time to step back from the fervor and the urgency of daily life and say, but what should we do? So you've heard Dwight Eisenhower's farewell speech calling for a world committed to the cause of peace. What does that look like? I want to talk now about war abolitionism. War abolitionism is a somewhat unique position, and it's not one that gets as much time in public conversation as you might think, because it's distinct from pacifism. So you might think that after listening to Plato and Smedley Butler and Eisenhower, that the real goal is to become pacifists, people who refuse to participate in war, even at the cost of prison time or public ridicule. And I want to say that there often is a time for pacifism. There are wartime situations where the only way to bring a nation to its senses is to refuse to give the nation what it most desperately needs, and that is troops and boots on the ground. Whenever our disagreements can be solved without the use of militarized violence, we should do so. But the reality is, pacifism is not always a plausible option towards peace. The reason Eisenhower failed, first as the head of NATO and later as a US president, to abolish war is because he did not have enough people at the table who shared his goal. He did not have the Soviet Union or their allies joining in the work of peace. He did not even have many of the slowly dismantling European empires as allies, such as the French, who were still deeply entangled in colonial projects. Even Ike himself utilized American foreign policy that meddled in the regimes of other nations in ways that served to destabilize them more than create a road for peace, such as in Guatemala. So the problem here is how do we carry this out, and how do we get enough people to help us carry this out? Ike's problem is he didn't even have enough people within his own cabinet to help him carry this out. But at least he had as his goal a world without war. Like Smedley Butler, he had determined to hell with war. In the wake of Eisenhower, Presidents JFK, Johnson, and Nixon would lead us into the disaster that was the Vietnam War. And there have been ongoing wars around the world in perpetuity. When we select presidents and prime ministers around the world, how often do we hear people clamoring for leaders who hold as one of their political principles the abolition of war? We will not make progress if we cannot even uphold Eisenhower's aspiration. When the United Nations was founded with influence by Eisenhower and other Allied leaders, the Charter of the United Nations echoed the sentiments we opened with from Eisenhower's A Chance for Peace address: the abolition of war, followed by the abolition of poverty. Smedley Butler noted in 1935 that the League of Nations had made no progress towards these goals. And I think it's fair to say that the United States has not even the United Nations has not even begun to approach either of those goals more than 75 years later. We have failed, and so it is worth asking why and what we should do about it. I want to end with a proposal for a political position that might give us a way forward. I call this non-pacifist war abolitionism. What do I mean by that? The position is a war abolitionism because it believes that all wars are evil, and the only just society is one where war has been abolished. This principle comes from the writings of Plato, who held that civil war within a society and war with neighboring nations are the two greatest political evils, and so must be avoided, but not at all costs. Plato advocated the maintenance of a standing army or the training of all citizens for a ready militia. So he was not a pacifist. How can one advocate the abolition of war but be willing to fight in a war? Isn't that a contradiction? Especially if one does not hold that there is anything like a just war that is possible. Well, the proposal here of war abolitionism is in response, the proposal in response to those questions is the recognition that there is a fundamental difference in the motivations for war. If a people are fighting a war so that their side or their country or their economic interests or their religious tribe will come out as the victors, then that is never a war worth fighting. This should scandalize many of us, since most of us think fighting for the self-defense of a country is a good thing, right? But what Eisenhower and Plato and Butler encourage us to ask is, suppose it is, what happens after? Is it just war after war after war, always hoping that you come out the victor in self-defense of your country? What about all those who suffer and die on all sides along the way? Fighting simply for self-defense is not enough. It's not enough to win, because winning does not make up for the brutality and stupidity and devastation of war. These motivations are not sufficient. But there is a motivation, in fact, only one motivation for fighting in a war that, while not serving to justify the war, is a worthwhile endeavor because it aims not simply to end or win that particular war, but to create the conditions for the abolition of all wars. If one is fighting not for their own side, but for all sides, not for their own country, but all countries, not for their religion, but all religions, and fighting in a manner that shows to every person, my only goal here is to end the existence of war for everyone, then, and only then, should a war be fought. That was Eisenhower's aim when he orchestrated the Allied invasion of Europe in June 1944. It wasn't just for the aim of liberating Europe from Nazi rule. It was for the purpose of liberating Germany from Nazi rule. But not only that, it was for the purpose of creating conditions under which a peace could be brokered, such that the possibility of such wars would not happen again. That was why he supported the United Nations and why he supported NATO as a temporary measure to try and bring the Soviet Union to the negotiating table for a lasting peace. Fighting a war where your sole aim is the abolition of war works better than the current laws of war and international treaties for ensuring against war crimes. The laws of war try to limit war crimes in advance without any kind of aim to the purpose of a particular war. So they're sort of anticipating, like, suppose you have no idea who the sides are. Let's make some rules for how all the sides are to conduct the war humanely so that they're not committing war crimes. By contrast, instead of doing things this way, the war abolitionist says we should ignore any notion of the laws of war because all war is a crime, and instead fight in a manner to abolish all war because that will fundamentally transform how we fight. One will not rape and demoralize citizens, or bomb hospitals, or create burn pits, or drop nuclear bombs if the goal is for you and the people you're fighting to someday live in perpetual peace. These things only happen because the peoples fighting are fighting to win the war, not to abolish war. The laws of war as they exist today are trying to do something impossible. Pretend that peoples can fight to win wars while doing so humanely. The war abolitionist says, no, the only way to fight wars with virtue is to hate war. To hate war so much that the only reason you are fighting at all is because you hate war. And you want to fight this war to abolish the need to fight any war. So the thinking here then is the war abolitionist rejects any idea that there's a just war or humane war. They think all war is evil, all wars should not happen. And so the only justified motivation for fighting a war is with the goal of abolishing the war. And once you have that as your aim, that will transform how you conduct yourself in war, what types of actions you are willing to commit against the other people you're in opposition to, because your goal is to have reconciliation with them and eventual perpetual peace. And that means there are all kinds of things you are not willing to do against them because you want friendship with those people, not war. And you are fighting with that as your goal. The war abolitionist believes that Plato had it right. The purpose of politics is peace, not war. The non-abolitionist uses peace to prepare for and instigate war. The abolitionist uses war to create the conditions for a universal and lasting peace. There can be no compromise between these aims for politics. I want to end with just a few more words from Dwight Eisenhower. These come from a speech he gave to a Canadian audience in 1946, just after the conclusion of World War II. He mused at the time that war is not inevitable, and the proof, he said, is found in the long-standing friendship and collaboration between the United States and Canada as border neighbors. So whenever people say that war between neighboring countries is inevitable, you should ask them about Canada and the United States. It just seems like if we can do peace here between two countries, we can do peace in other parts of the world between two countries. Eisenhower said that these two countries are proof that lasting peace is possible. He then went on to outline how the peace that we enjoy in the United States with Canada could come to circumvent the globe. Eisenhower says, our two nations have lived as peaceful neighbors so long that in our own relationships we have totally forgotten the meaning of fears and lusts for conquest that bred the war from which we just emerged. The ripeness of our friendship is apparent for all to see in a border which marks separate sovereignty, but binds together rather than divides. The secret is nothing other than mutual understanding and respect. But we must not oversimplify the problem. We must not delude ourselves into believing that all nations will easily achieve this broad result, or that nothing more is demanded than verbal adherence to beautiful generality. But it can be achieved if every nation realizes that its very survival may depend on its earnest cooperation in the peaceful settlement of disputes. All must learn that in cooperation there is giving as well as receiving. The one that eternally gives and does not receive will eventually exhaust itself. In the contrary case, the recipient becomes nothing but the object of another's bounty. To cooperate, we must give and take in a spirit of mutual, sympathetic understanding. Our two countries have long done it. The United Nations did it in World War II. The practice must continue and must become universal. When that is done, the fortifications that bristle along borders throughout the world will speedily come tumbling down, and from the hearts of populations will be lifted age-old burdens of fear. Another mistake we must not make is to assume that this crusade for promoting mutual understanding can be successfully conducted exclusively by others, by the world's statesmen and political leaders. Each of us, however humble, has a part to play. Governments may wisely deal with the problems which rise in our concerted search for peace, but in the end, it will be the citizens of all countries who must outlaw war. If you are interested in this topic and want to hear more about Plato and listen to a robust discussion on Plato's discussion of war and peace at the beginning of the Laws, I invite you to go check out the podcast Plato's Pod, which has a channel on YouTube. Look for the episode Plato's Laws, Book 1, Part 1, where I host a discussion with a group of people on the first part of Plato's Book 1 discussion of war and peace. Thank you.